They say drums, so they have to be played fast or they have to be played loud or strong. One thing about tabla, it's an instrument that can be enjoyed slow or fast, rhythmically or melodically. So it gives you all these elements.
Well, this is an honor and a pleasure. I sort of want to start off with a little story from a course that I've taught periodically at Brown, which has nothing to do directly with hearing, but it's going to lead into something.
What was that?
The course I teach was astrobiology, which is the study of looking for life in outer space. Okay. And it's one of the more peculiar courses because there's no real data on it, so it's a lot of fun. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I have to have the students do at the end is a study of communication. How do you communicate when you have nothing in common? So I said, okay, you think you've got a signal from an alien planet. Mm-hmm. They know nothing about you.
No, they know about William Shatner.
Well, everyone knows about William Shatner. He's already been there, and he's done rude things to the females of the species.
Yes.
So what I've told them is that you have to come up with a communication that will transcend everything. You don't know what they look like, you don't know what they smell like, you don't know anything about their culture. And the kids would come up with these great ideas. It's like the old NASA standby of naked people holding their hands up. Mm-hmm. And to which I said, okay, so the aliens think that, oh, look, you put your naked pet monkeys up there, and they can wave their flippers, big deal. Everything from writing math equations, great, the aliens don't know your math, doesn't work. That occasionally works. The only thing that ever worked and that matched the requirements of communication without relying on words, without relying on culture, that showed intelligence, intention, and an ability to change environment was a drum solo. And this was the only thing that one class managed to come up that they could communicate with another. Ah. And so to me, as someone who has studied the brain and the underlying elements of it, that one moment with these bunch of kids who thought they were being smartasses really just highlighted for me how important the basis of pattern and rhythm is in humanity and what drives their humanity. So I was wondering if I could put upon you to take, I can't remember the name of the small instrument. The small drum.
Small instrument.
The small drum. The one that was easy to hold.
Oh, the world is a small instrument, isn't it?
If you want to play the table, all I'd like you to do is two things. Yeah. One is I'd like you to play the fastest possible rhythm you can. Not for long. I don't want to wear anything out like the furniture. The fastest possible rhythm you can play with your hands. I'm not just testing you. Oh, do we want to see you do it again? Okay.
But because my mind is working, but my brain is still rebooting. So.
Okay. Well, you're also touring, which is something that always turned my brain off.
So I was just wondering about that because are the mind and the brain two different things?
Yes, completely.
They most certainly are. This is a small drum. So what am I supposed to do? Usually I'm used to playing two drums.
Okay.
But this is one. It's a kanjira. Basically, it looks like it doesn't do much, but it can pierce through any big drum kit.
just got carpal tunnel watching you. Okay, what would be the slowest musically useful rhythm?
Slowest musical use of the rhythm.
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean, what beat would be the most useful?
I would
At
imagine that
slowest.
the slowest would be 60 BPM.
So once a second,
Yeah,
something like that.
yeah.
Okay.
And when I say slowest, you could probably go half that. You could go to 30, but for some reason we seem to or tend to respond to 120 BPM. And so even if we count down to 60, we will still, if you go this, people will be thinking, so there's two.
Okay.
Boo, bop, boo, bop, boo. So this will be 60, but people are 120, or they're doing two in the space of one.
Nice.
So keeping that in mind, I would say that 60 would be a basic BPM, the slowest that a human body or brain or would register comfortably and would want to move to, or I mean, I guess simply that will be the case.
But what you've just done is bracket 3 or 4 mechanisms that work together in the brain: hearing, motor function, and attention. I mean, if you played 2 beats per minute, no one would really see it as a continuum unless you also had a bunch of other things going and you just
absolutely.
got stuck playing the bass drum.
Yeah.
But 60 beats per minute is relaxed heartbeat. 120 beats per minute is an excited heartbeat.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's always been interesting to me is how what we hear facilitates changes in our body. And the way that you get something called auditory facilitation. If I put you, this was an experiment I ran years ago, where I had people walk in a room wearing little EEG units and just had noise bands, just white noise, pulsing at about 70 beats per minute. Right. And then slowed it down to about 60. And all their heart rates dropped to match the 60 beats per minute. One of the reasons is that hearing, which I call the universal sense, mostly because all animals with backbones hear, is the oldest rhythm and it's the fastest rhythm, and so it gets in under our consciousness. When you look at things and when you see things, you know, we're visual animals. You know, looking at you, and I'll recognize you visually. And we think of vision as the speed of thought, and we think that that's really fast, but it's not. You think and you see it about the same rate, which is about one thought or one vision every half second to a second. But you can actually pick out sounds easily at 20 to 50 one-thousandths of a second without straining. What you were playing when you were playing high speed versus low speed, what you were doing is you were giving the bracket of making things biologically relevant from the very slowest to the very highest to bring in not just hearing, but our ability to pay attention and clump things, to say this is a rhythm versus this is just a bunch of random sounds. And how to be able to get your brain, which is processing at almost visual rates, to get it to put out a motor pattern, to do something that'll keep your attention and thus create music. Hearing will work much faster than music would ever be able to do. But it's so tied in with other physiological processes that are tied into our heart rate, our respiration, that music becomes the rhythm that underlies much of what we do as human beings.
So I have a question or a thought that I am thinking about a pattern, a rhythmic pattern, and sitting in front of an audience, and I'm about to execute that. And once I play it, there are a bunch of people in the audience who get it, and then there are some who don't get it. So how is it possible that my brain is thinking of this stuff. But at the same time, there are others whose brain also thought of it to be able to then accept it as something that they recognize and they enjoyed. And then others didn't.
It's a combination of factors. I presume you started playing music very young.
Yeah.
Okay. About how old were you think, when you first started bothering your parents like I had to?
Maybe 3.
Okay. So you basically started as soon as you could think.
I didn't know if I don't even, I remember stealing pots from my mother's kitchen and turning them over and playing them.
Okay.
There is a vague visual in my mind about it, but I don't remember what I did or anything, but I know that I was punished for...
Artists are supposed to suffer, so are scientists.
But not for taking the pot and turning it over, but in the process throwing the curry out.
If you'd left it in, it would have sounded interesting, although messier to play. But you have laid down over the course of your life basic pathways. Anytime you hear something, you physically change your brain. Anytime you do something, you physically change your brain. It's something called Hebbian plasticity. There's a rule that we learn first week of grad school: whatever fires together, wires together. If you had never heard anything before, you would, acoustically, your brain would be kind of neutral. But the first time you heard something, a bird call, a pounding of a drum, all of a sudden some neurons would fire together. And the more you do that, the more they physically connect to each other and make strong bonds. So this is how, when you start playing something new for the first time, you're starting to lay down these tracks. And after a few years of playing the same pattern, you don't think. It's become a hardwired pattern in you. But it's based on your history. There's only so many basic rhythmic patterns you can do as a human being. 2 arms, you're limited by the speed of not wanting to pull your arms off your bones and other unpleasant things. So what you end up doing is you start overlapping with some people who have had some history of rhythmic training, or people who have heard you playing this before, and it calls up those paths. And any kind of recollection is a reward into itself to your brain, and it strengthens what it's heard before. So when you come up with a pattern in your brain that's something that you haven't played before, but it's drawing on what you have played before, you're using the frontal portion of your brain. This is decision-making, the executive part of your brain, and you come up with a pattern the way a painter would come up with the basic outline of a painting, or a sculptor would come up with a 3-dimensional space. You then pass that information to a region in front of the motor strip, the part of your cortex that controls your body motion, and it makes a plan. I am going to do this. And then it sends the information down your spinal cord to move your arms. You don't even have to think about this very much, especially if it's a pattern that you've played before or related to one you've played before. You don't have to think about doing ornamentation if you know the basics. Your brain has already set up this pattern. What's interesting about it is that it's just, you have this planning function, then you have the pre-planning function, sends the pattern out. But to also the back of your brain, this really primitive part of your brain, the cerebellum, is constantly listening to what you're doing and adjusting the plan. Oops, well, you wouldn't make a mistake, but you know, some people do. And so, well, you just, and it corrects you on the fly, or it sends you out this tiny little message saying, that wasn't right, and it reduces the pleasure of playing something right. So you have this vast neural orchestra going on, almost like a ballet, telling you, you're playing this right, you're playing it wrong. And the people out there who are listening are getting the mechanical changes from the surface of the drum, changing the pressure in the air, moving their eardrums, and trying to match patterns in their brains. If their brains do not have or are not receptive to similar patterns, they're not necessarily going to like what you're playing or get it.
Okay.
And, or they might be someone who are just very, very open to new things and are looking. There are people who are neural seekers. They will also get it, but they won't get it as hard as they get the next time they hear the recording of it.
So this It sounds like there are at least, what, about 8 or 10 different functions taking place at the same time, maybe 8 or 10,000 things
Million.
that are in play.
Yeah.
So when that's happening, am I multitasking?
No. Not up here. Sorry. Your brain is great at multitasking as long as you leave out all the conscious parts.
Aha.
I mean, you're doing millions of things every moment. Most of them you will never remember in your entire life.
Okay.
Where it gets complicated and computationally expensive is when you have to actually limit what's going on and pay attention to it. And suddenly take this pounds of gray stuff and say, only pay attention to this. If you try and say, pay attention to this and the fact that I really don't like how the studio monitor is, and I think she's a little bit off rhythm, and I really wish I hadn't had that for lunch, you're not doing any of them well.
Okay.
Humans are very good at focusing on single tasks. As soon as we start doing what we think is cognitive multitasking, we're dividing up our attention, we're dividing up our resources, and performance will start to go into the toilet.
So keeping that in mind and that thought, are we actually in reality improvising?
That's a tough. You can say that you're always improvising because reality is never the same moment to moment. But it sort of ties into the question of, are you the same person when you wake up in the morning? Your brain is a pattern-seeking machine. It's this wet, squishy drum machine. It's looking for biologically relevant patterns. And this is useful and not useful. It's useful in that if you have a basic task to do, if you want to play a piece of music, but you want to play it different, you want to just riff on it a bit, the basic patterns are there, and you can do it, and you can make little alterations, and that's all you have to pay attention to, because you don't have to pay attention to something that you've already practiced for years. The problem kicks in with this is that since you're always looking for patterns, you often don't actually, you pay attention to things that aren't really there because you want there to be patterns. And this is something that's very big in vision. I'm not a vision scientist. I just think that there's way too many of those people. Seriously, if you go to a society for neuroscience, you're studying vision, or you're studying Alzheimer's, or you're studying motor behavior. Hearing is just way down because we're visual creatures. But what people don't pay attention to is that we're so slow visually that we get a lot of flotsam in there. We're always looking for something that's there, even if it's not. So you'll see faces in the rocks. You'll see the duck in the clouds. You'll see, wasn't that my high school girlfriend walking down the street looking exactly the same 30 years later? You get the same patterns. Sound doesn't work that way. Your hearing is so much faster than vision, 20 to 50 times faster, that it's closer to actual reality because it's a mechanical sense, not a chemical sense. And so that when you focus on things with hearing, you get a closer map of reality than when you focus on them visually.
Okay. So I grew up in this world where we took pride in saying that we spontaneously create music based on a given raga scale, based on a given rhythmic cycle, so on. But I have always wondered, how much do we actually spontaneously create? And that's why I was asking the questions the way they were. When I get on stage, I find myself playing, I would say, I get on the stage with practically no idea what I'm going to do.
Sort of like now.
But at the same time, that's not really true. I do have an idea of what I'm going to do. I've just not accepted it. So I go on stage and I've convinced myself, God, I'm really creating out of scratch. There's nothing on the table, there's nothing on the canvas, and from there is going to emerge this beautiful landscape or painting or whatever. But that isn't really true, because there is something already existing, like you mentioned, There are familiar ideas, familiar patterns, familiar thoughts that I'm going to draw upon, and I'm going to rely on the fact that the people sitting in the audience already have some inkling of what those thoughts, those ideas, and those patterns are. So I'm relying on that, and then I'm saying, okay, I'm going to touch upon those, and therefore make my connection with my audience and my fans. So what I'm going to basically be doing is fooling them into believing that I'm improvising, totally knowing that I'm not, but yet being smirk about it that yes, I am. But having said that, even that process of being able to pick and choose almost instantaneously on the stage as to looking at 100 people in the audience and probably knowing faces, recognizing them in some instant that these people have been in concerts before. So I'm safe. And to be able to do that, to be able to get on stage and pick and choose on the fly from stuff that has already existed in my mind and already existed in my repertoire and already been tried and tested on with the audiences. Is that something that is slow thinking or fast thinking?
I think that that's basically almost subconscious thinking. It's not instinctive response, but this is something you've been doing for a while. You're looking for social familiars. You're basically working within the constraints of your previous patterns. And you can't get away from that. That doesn't make you less creative or less improvisational. You're basically carrying around 350 million years of evolution that's constrained your hearing, constrained how you can move, and a 250,000 years of being human has given us some shared heritage. And then the people who have come to your concerts already have, you've already got sort of a selection thing going there. They're coming to hear you. But what you're doing is you've already taken all of your basic material as a given. You've taken the audience who has come to hear you as a given. Even if you think that you're only being improvisational in this narrow little constraint, that's all that really counts. There are only so many types of basic rhythms that you can possibly do because you only have 2 arms and you're playing a percussive instrument. When you find people who are desperately trying to be really improvisational and trying way too hard, which gave birth to acid jazz and some of the synthesists who just pushed. But when you're trying to do something that defies rhythm, defines normal harmonic music, things like that, it becomes a very, very tight selective group. They're basically using the constraints of the art form and breaking away from it. And they're still just as constrained as somebody who's playing familiar music. What you're doing is you're taking the basis that you already had and freeing up the top of it. It's not slow thinking, but it's sort of like you're sliding right along between your subconscious and your conscious.
Okay. What about, I mean, this is rhythm. What about pitch? I mean, somewhere I've read that, that there are hairs inside our ears, and when a sound is impinged on them, they vibrate based on certain pitches. Some will vibrate at C sharp, some will at E, some at G, whatever. And when they do that, that's how the brain is sent signal as to what pitch it is, and you recognize it, and therefore what kind of emotion it is conveying, and so how to relate to that emotion, and so on. Is that, I mean, can you?
You just covered the entire auditory system from the hair cells in the ear all the way through the basal cortex.
Okay, let's go home.
Okay, we're done. That was Intro Auditory Neuroscience 101. All got A's. Well, your ears are basically the way you described it. There's these sort of, the cochlea is a snail shell shape that houses multiple membranes full of fluid, and you have these things called hair cells. And they're basically little cylinders with little tufts that sit on top. And they're placed along this spiral form, which is very narrow, right near where the sound comes in. And so respond to best to high frequency sounds. So like if you tighten down the drum, it gives it a higher pitch.
Yeah.
Further along, right. So further along the cochlea, it gets wider and it gets looser, so it's more responsive to lower pitched sounds. Now, we're saying pitch, and you just described it in terms of note names. One of the things that makes hearing a little bit weird, in most senses weird, is that we're not hearing the physics. The physics are how many times per second the air is vibrating. We're not linear. Nothing about wetware, about brains, about senses, about living things is ever linear. You have hair cells that will vibrate best at, say, 1,000 cycles per second. And some will vibrate best at 1,050 cycles per second. But you cannot hear that. It's too close together. Your ear breaks up pitch into chunks. So that there have been a lot of interesting studies that have shown that the way the ear breaks up the pitch range, and you're good for, it's from approximately 80 hertz, the lowest bass you can think of, up to 20 kilohertz when you're a kid. Our age, probably about 16 kilohertz.
Yes. I find myself frequently telling the sound guy, 12K, 16K,
Yeah.
just 2 dB plus, don't go below 80 hertz, because I'm not hearing 60.
Yeah, and meanwhile, so that you can hear the high frequency if all the dogs in the neighborhood are throwing up, it's like, ah! But you break up these pitches into these little bands called critical bands, and you can't tell the difference between the two. But depending on how close those bands are to each other, defines the relationship between what we think of as pitch. So a band that's right next to each other might be C to C sharp. Play a C and C sharp together on a piano, and it sounds dissonant because they're too close. They're overlapping and they're not harmonic. And your brain loves harmonics because it's a regular mathematical pattern. So if you move it so that it's a fifth, so you're playing a C and a G, the harmonics overlap, even within the ear. And this, you can watch, if you get specialized microphotography, you can actually watch cochleas vibrating in synchrony as you get further and closer together to harmonic chords. And they pass these signals all the way up to your brain. But because they're doing it mechanically, what happens is air pressure hits the eardrum, bends those little hairs, and it physically just pulls open a channel that lets fluid in from your ear, which sends a neural signal. That happens fast enough that you can actually tell the difference in sounds on the millionths of a second scale.
I've also heard that you can actually watch the graph by putting some whatever devices, electrode onto the, and by not hearing yourself but watching someone else hearing the pitches and seeing the graph, you can actually tell what note that person is hearing. It's
something called cochlear microphonics. And what it is in the times when I would do invasive research, which is basically put an electrode, calm the animal down, put an electrode here right into the auditory nerve, play a sound, and you listen. One of the first things we do as auditory neuroscientists is we don't worry too much about the oscilloscope. We attach it to an audio amplifier so we can hear the brain. And the brain sings. If you play, and I used to do this with frogs, because frogs are really good for low frequency hearing, and they're really tolerant of surgery because they'll go on and have happy frog lives afterwards. Whereas the bats are trying to kill you the whole time. They don't hear any music anyway. But we would drop. It's my life. It's different.
It's your Let's keep it that way.
I have extra frogs if you want. But if you drop an electrode into a frog's...
But yet you wear a bat.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I'm celebrating that this is actually the only animal that's never bitten me.
Oh.
I've worked with dolphins, broke my ribs. Frogs tried to swallow me. Hamsters, I hate hamsters. Just chewed through metal gloves to get at me. Bats have never actually given me a problem. They just kind of want to be fed.
And they're good for the environment. So.
Yep. And they're really wonderful to listen to if you have a bat microphone. They're little weird songs.
And they made lots of money for Hollywood.
But anyway, if you drop the electrode into the frog's auditory nerve and you play a note for it, you will hear the nerve sing that note.
Okay.
And it's true for humans as well. It's true for every animal, for certain frequencies.
Okay.
Because the way that we process low frequency sounds, bass, low end of a piano, low pitched drums, is that your ear actually figures out the timing of the changes in pressure and locks to them. So that the nerve will fire every time the sound cycles up and down. So if it's a low frequency sound, the nerve becomes the sound maker and passes that signal up. When you get up to very high frequency sounds, it's when you're talking about 10,000 cycles per second or even 5,000, the top of the musical range. It can't keep up anymore. So then it depends strictly on where it is in the ear rather than how fast it can lock up.
So we're basically locked down into the 12 notes of the piano.
That's one of the theories. It doesn't always hold up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's hear about that.
Oh, okay. You got to remember, those studies were all done by people who published in the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America, and for the most part, they're in the U.S. or Europe. I had a student who was a really smart kid and loved gamelan music. Okay. And the first time she played it for me, I'm going, can't they tune this thing before they record it? And she said, that's what I'm looking for. And because to me it was dissonant. So she took this is just an undergraduate student, really smart, said, okay, took students who had never heard gamelan before, had them listen to half an hour of Western music, just classical, I think it was Bach and Beethoven, and then played them the gamelan and had them rate, was it consonant, was it dissonant? Did it sound smooth, did it sound rough? And they're all saying, this is really dissonant, I can't listen to this is making my head hurt. Then what she did was she ran the exact same thing, except she played gamelan softly while they were waiting for half an hour. And then ran it, and all the numbers changed. More than half of them suddenly said, it's at least partially consonant. And that's only half an hour. So the idea that there's a biological basis for some intervals holds up. In all music, there's an octave. In all music, there's a fifth. In most music, there's a fourth and a third.
Yes.
These are also the intervals that are in all human speech sounds. So it may not be that our music was driven by the organization of our ear, but our ears are best tuned to the organization of how we make sounds, and we've built our musical structure from that.
Okay. And also I imagine that we build our likes and dislikes based on what we hear and what we recognize and what we choose. And so keeping that in mind, I wondered about that at times because we always say that, let's create something new, something different, something that has never been done before. And I think about that, and in my mind, and I say, but is it possible? Because hasn't everything been already done? Haven't all the notes, combination and permutations been played? So when we talk about our brain accepting something, is it accepting that has already been done a zillion times before and being done again as nostalgia and enjoying it in that manner? Or actually thinking that this person is doing something that I have never experienced before or seen or done before? And the reason why I'm asking this is because, you talk about, great minds. You talk about Socrates, you talk about Confucius, you talk about Nietzsche or Sun Tzu or whoever they are. And then we come down to the great sages when you talk about Sufis like Rumi or Hafiz, or you talk about, oh, I don't know, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi or Sri Chinmaya or Satya Sai Baba, or whoever are the great thinkers or people who have this ability to be able to tell you about how to find nirvana or how to find God, how to do all that, that will make your life having worth its weight in gold or whatever that you've done. You've done what you're supposed to do and have been put on this earth to do. So keeping that in mind, are we saying same thing over and over again, and the brain is responding to it differently every time it hears it? Or are we actually able to alter whatever it is that has already been said before, but in a way that the brain registers it as something entirely different and new and a unique thought process?
I think it's a combination of both. There's always commonality that we have to build from. Whether it's philosophical or it's biological or it's artistic, we all have the same understructure. We all come from the same evolutionary place. We all come from the same basic building blocks. But our environment's constantly changing. So playing something on a completely different instrument changes your whole relationship to your physical space and to what you're going to hear. I mean, if I wanted to try and play tabla, I'd come up with an entirely different kind of mindset. Because, no, that's okay. I do that in the privacy of my own home, like all my other bad habits.
Oh, rhythm is a good habit.
Yes, but all I'm really good for is banging on a conga when I'm in a really bad mood. And then my wife usually wants to be down in the basement working on something where she can't hear me.
Yeah, as I was saying earlier, having a drum and being able to play on it is such a fortunate thing, because I mean, I've got something to beat up instead of having a shouting tree. It's always good to do it in rhythm and time and dance to it and get your frustrations out, and at the same time, experience the joy of having created something new.
But if you take that basis that we all share, and then you change the instrument, you change the environment, you change the technology, the day-to-day environment is never the same. If you're creating something that is going to be popular, you're always going to be pushing the same tunes, the same changes. You always have the Justin Bieber, Lady Gaga, or pushing it back to the pop music of the 70s and the 60s. You'll come up with something that everyone responds to in a generic fashion. And a lot of their response is going to be based on social factors, the fact that their friends are responding to it, so they like it too.
Okay.
But if you're doing something that's from you that you want to think of, no one knows what goes on inside your brain. No matter how many beautiful pictures you see in the New York Times of an fMRI showing this is why you vote Republican or this is why you're left-handed, don't believe it. The brain is still the unexplored territory. It's vaster than space. So whatever, your brain, 82 billion neurons and I think 10 trillion connections is all yours. And it's been shaped from the day you were born, before you were born, because you were hearing your third trimester. And you're hearing your mother's heartbeat, the respirations, the results of the bad food that night, or if she goes out dancing. Your whole life is shaped in a moment-by-moment basis, and it's all in the details.
I mean, there is a 10,000 hours theory. I mean, you need to spend at least 10,000 hours practicing or something or other in order to be able to be reasonably decent at being able to play something or perform something or whatever. So, but there are child stars. There are people who Mozart has written whatever, whether it was good or bad, that's not the question. But he wrote a symphony when he was what, 4 years old or 6, 7 years old, whatever. I know that I played my first concert when I was 7. I know that there are other musicians in India, like the great mandolin master U. Srinivas, who was actually pointing to musicians performing on stage and saying, that's not the correct note of the raga. And he was 6 years old. So, I mean...
And he got beaten pretty often, didn't he?
He was taken away out of the concert hall, but eventually accepted as somebody who was blessed by some spirit. Hazrat Inayat Khan, the great Sufi, says that the reason why we have these child prodigies is because at the time of transition, when the spirit came in, it passed another spirit that, you know, transmitted this incredible knowledge or whatever it was to that spirit that was going in to the fetus. And so you have this child which grew up in the womb, in the shallow pond with inner ears and so on, and was able to develop this incredible genius genes inside of himself or herself, and became a great artist at 6, 7, 8 years old. Some people say that it's inborn, it's genes, it's DNA, or whatever it is. So, I mean, but it all ties into, I mean, somehow this thing has to be involved in it, and it's got to tie your heart, what you're feeling, your emotions, everything, and then you come out. So all this information has to, reasonably thinking, take, I mean, the great masters of India, great ustads like late Ustad Ali Akbar Khan Sahib used to say in his own way, you have to practice, he used to let you know, at least 18 hours a day for 20 years before you can play one perfect note. Now that's just one perfect note.
Okay.
I mean, you got to come back here a few times in this
I was
world
going to
be
say.
able to finally play a concert or 7 notes or whatever. But so said that. But at the same time, he was a genius performer when he was 14, when he was 12. He was amazing. So how do we account for this discrepancy? And how do we explain the genius arriving into someone? My father, his father or father before him or mother or whoever, they never played any music in their life, ever. But then he came into this world. I mean, I always say that you know, even gods make mistake, and the god made a mistake. You know, what is the bird that brings the babies?
Storks.
Yeah. So the stork was given the wrong address and arrived in this village in Punjab, and then God suddenly said, "Oops, this was wrong. Addresses got mixed up. He should have gone to Ustad so-and-so's house, this little child, but he's in this farmer's house. Now what do I do?" So he sends, so God has to correct this mistake, so he sends great signals in forms of dreams and visions and stuff into my father's mind, and he's 6 and 7, and he's seeing these things, this vision, this face, and something in his mind is telling him he has to go there, he has to go there. He's suddenly able to play some rhythms by just watching some, you know, local, you know, in villages, there used to be these touring companies that went from villages to villages doing the story of Ramayana or whatever stuff, and he's watching them. And next thing you know, he's actually playing what the guy has been playing last night or the night before, and he's singing the rhythms and singing songs and stuff. And then he's 10 and he's 11, he's still seeing this vision, and finally he just cannot stand it anymore, and he runs away from home and arrives at this city and somehow finds his way to this great master, and lo and behold, that's the face he's been seeing in his vision. So, and finally arrives, and the god, you know, has a sigh of relief and says, "Oh, we are back on path. Everything is as it should be."
Kill the paperwork.
Yeah, paperwork. You know, it's all tick mark over here, and Allah Raka is back online, and he's going to be what he's supposed to be. So is that what it is? Is this what it is? Is DNA? Is genes? I mean,
it's a lot of different things. And one thing that bothers me as a neuroscientist, especially these days, is the fact that humans are probably, the one thing that makes us really special isn't tool use, and isn't music, isn't language, it's flexibility. This kind of constraint is part of normal growing up because, when you're born, none of your senses are very well tuned. You're just sort of like the baby lies there, sees everything shiny, everything is loud, and some people never really coordinate. A lot of people who have autism, they don't have sensory integration properly. But what you do end up having is that as you get older, you start channeling all of your sensory information in more and more into familiar paths. I mean, Mozart wrote a concert when he was 4. He didn't write a raga. He wrote what he was familiar with. Your father didn't write, a romantic ear symphony. It was exposed. But at that age, your brain is wide open to possibilities and will suck up everything. Had your father been exposed to a lot of Western music, or had Mozart heard classical Indian music, music would have been completely different. I always said I could go blind because I always had very bad vision, contact lenses and glasses, and still, what does that say? But going deaf is something that's always frightened me because I did go deaf very briefly when I was very young. I had chicken pox and got the blisters on both ears. So it was about 3 months.
I heard that.
And so I don't really remember. It was about 3, but I do know that I'm very uneasy if things get very quiet. I didn't do something about it, like walk into an anechoic room. Deaf people have just as rich a life, but their attention is different. What they have to use vision, they have to use touch. But a couple of years ago, I got to work with Evelyn Glennie, and I don't know, and she's not totally deaf, but she's close to profoundly deaf. She has a little low frequency hearing left.
Okay.
And I was working.
Interesting about low frequency.
It's because high frequency is the most delicate, and usually if you have a disease state, the first things that go are the hair cells that are in the outer area, and so you lose high frequency to low frequencies. Also, very low pitch, even though you don't hear it very well, you're picking it up with the other part of your inner ear. And this is something that if you go to a concert for the deaf, where it's a raging bass, and yet they're all dancing in rhythm, you're still hearing it. The other half of your ear is called the vestibular part, and it's about balance. It's got these little sensors that respond to gravity, respond to lateral motion, respond to rotation. All it does is measure acceleration of your head, but it's so deeply buried in everything else that you do that people didn't even know it was a sense until about 100 years ago. And even today, people think, it has to do with balance. It turns out, and I was involved in a very interesting project. It turns out if you play about an 80 decibel tone at 80 hertz, you barely hear it because your ears are not good at picking up very low frequency sounds, so you have to really blast it. But if you hit something at 95 dB, it's comfortably loud and very low pitch, but it's loud enough to actually trigger the balance part of your brain. And this is why clubs have loud, regular bass. Because it's not just letting you hear it, it's actually making you move. Animal communication, if there are any linguists in the room, I'm sure you're going to throw something at me, but animal communication can be every bit as ornate as human communication. It just does not follow the kind of rules that human language is so fond of. So if you try to communicate with an animal, frankly, what we do best is we teach the animal to understand us. We still haven't cracked too many animal languages. What humans are good at is binding time. And to do that, we have to be able to recognize patterns. And to do that, we're able to segment our attention on what we think is important. So a small child who people have thought, there's no music in the house, they haven't heard anything except casual stuff, is surrounded every day by rhythms, watching the mother's legs walk back and forth at a certain rhythm, watching how it takes the clouds to move across the sky, watching the sun move across the sky, just sitting there someone's foot tapping. If this is what grabs their attention, this is what's important to them, especially in a young child, all, unless they're very badly damaged, all infants and small children are geniuses. They can take anything and turn it into their shtick.